How we see. In this particular video, we're going to have a look at some of the characteristics that shape our vision, and we'll link them into some quite practical design aspects when we're thinking about how do we create our interfaces in such a way that will support or will work with aspects then of our vision. So first of all, we'll talk about the different regions or parts of our vision. And when we're thinking about this, we can segment it into central and peripheral vision. Central vision is the thing we're focusing on. We see that in good detail, it is in focus, and that is where we're looking directly at. Peripheral vision then is the totality, everything else that falls inside our visual field. And normally we can't see that in detail, it's sort of blurred or it's more fuzzy. Movement, though, that happens inside our peripheral vision, where we actually have something that's changing and moving, that tends to attract our attention. So something happens in our peripheral vision, we'll look across at it, we'll be inclined to change our focus, so we focus on that particular movement. What that means then is that, and often frustratingly so, unfortunately it means this, if you're looking, for example, at a web page, quite often you will find that for the advertisements that are there, they're going to use rapidly changing or flashing elements that have a sudden and dramatic visual change. And they do that because they know when they do that, your natural inclination of your visual system is to focus on what has changed. So that's actually a distracting bit, and quite often then is one of the frustrating aspects around those types of imagery and marketing ones, is that they use attention grabbing techniques. And when we say attention grabbing, we mean ones or techniques that work with our visual system to try to encourage it to focus on the advert, even though that's maybe not something we want it to do. So, a few takeaways for us then when we're thinking about our actual design. If we want the user to concentrate on a particular task or area in terms of how they're using our product or what they're doing at that particular point, we want to make sure for the rest of what we design that we don't provide other sort of flashing elements that fall inside the peripheral vision, because if we do that inside our application, we run the risk then of distracting the user, of encouraging them to focus on the other aspect. Conversely, if we want to make the user aware of something has happened and it's important, but we're sitting thinking, well, the user may not be looking at this particular area, in that sense then we maybe should consider through your interface including something that will involve a flash or a change that is likely then to attract the user's attention. Peripheral vision is actually used in quite a subtle but important way for us to understand the totality of the scene that we see. We might sort of think, oh, well, it's not really important, we just focus on particular bits and the rest is just all fuzzy and hazy. We use the information that falls inside our peripheral vision to actually make quite fundamental decisions about what it is we are looking at, the overall thing. Our central vision is actually quite small, it's quite refined. And our peripheral vision then actually covers a large amount of our visual field. So whilst it may not be in precise detail, the things that we do perceive in that, we use that then to understand, to identify our overall setup. What that means from our point of view then as designers is that those large structural elements that we might have in terms of how we define regions and position large groups of controls, they're actually quite important. The user, unless they're focusing specifically at it, won't be able to see things in detail, but in their peripheral vision they'll be able to see the rough sort of shape and layout of the screen. So those we can actually use through that structural design to help orientate the user, to let the user effortlessly, using the peripheral vision, understand whereabouts they're at, what they're seeing roughly on screen. Another aspect's around inattentional blindness or selective attention. And this ties into the fact that if you're focusing on a particular activity and something else happens inside your visual field that you're not sort of queued up to be wanting to see, for expecting to see, but it still falls inside a visual field. Now, you may then at that point fail to actually consciously notice that particular event. Probably the most famous example of this is the sort of the gorilla basketball experiment, where you had a group of people all moving around in sort of a small huddle with basketball or a couple of basketballs that they were throwing from one member to the next. So it's quite a rich interactive visual field. And they tasked the experimenters then to, well, count how many times the basketball was passed from one person to another. So that was the task. Happened over maybe, say, a minute. And in the middle of the experiment, they had an individual dressed up in a gorilla suit walk into the middle of the scene, face the camera, wave at the camera, and then walk off. And at the end of the experiment, they asked the people, okay, so how many times was the ball passed? Oh, 18. Oh, well done. Did you notice the gorilla? And it turned out that roughly about 50% of people went, what gorilla? I didn't see anything. And that ties into the fact that because they were focusing on one task, and that's what they were applying their attention to, they were purposefully then excluding other stimuli that they thought that's not really important. Now, they've done eye tracking and eye gazing tests, and people do see the gorilla, but they don't just become consciously aware of it because of their focus. Our takeaway from our point of view is that because we put something on the screen, we show something, some information, some display, some update, that doesn't actually mean that the user has become aware of it. And that's actually quite a trap that's quite is easy to fall into, that from a sort of developer's point of view, okay, we want to provide the user with this information, oh, it's up on screen, our job is done. No, it's not. From a designer's point of view, we then want to think about, okay, so we have it on screen. Are we sufficiently confident that the user is going to see it, is likely to see it? What is the user doing at that particular point? Do we need to have other aspects then to highlight that information, to draw attention to it? A few other aspects then, and this ties into some of the earlier talks then, that if we position objects spatially close together, our brain automatically links them together. So things that are close together belong together. And could be, in this case, you can see sort of two groups of two circles as opposed to one group of four circles. But it also applies, for example, to pictures and captions. If they're physically located together in terms of a spatial arrangement, we assume, oh, they must go together. So a few takeaways in this here is that if we have items, could be graphics, could be text, could be controls, doesn't really matter, and we want them to look as if they belong together, then we should specially place them together, because that will mean we most naturally, we almost automatically, effortless see them, or will group them together. And that may mean then we don't need to use other ways of grouping them in terms of sticking them inside some surrounding line or box, or some other way of highlighting that they all fit together. Conversely, if we want to be able to show things that are separated, if we move them apart, that's a perfectly good way of being able to do that. We make sure we're putting space between things that are not really related. That will get across then that convention to the user in terms of how he or she sees things. Faces are actually really important. Certainly, we're biologically we're wired up to pay particular attention to faces. It's something we can't help but do. That means that we recognize that's a face quicker than we recognize other types of objects. It means that depending upon what that face is conveying in terms of the emotion, we pick that up quite quickly, and again we react to that. And if you have an image of a face looking directly at the user, then that actually is quite a strong indication. It will catch our attention. Oh, this person is looking directly at me, even if this person's just an image on a screen. Also, alongside this, that wherever a face looks, if we have a face looking at something in particular, so for example, it's an image of a person looking at a particular object, as you can see on the screen here, first of all, we would naturally be drawn to look at the face. We will see that the eyes in the face are looking at a specific object, and they will then naturally look at the object that's been looked at inside the picture. We do that almost effortlessly, automatically. So again, you quite often find that used inside marketing, where if you want to draw somebody's attention to something, you can use faces as a way of doing that, of attracting attention and of directing attention. So for another aspect, I mean, I suppose we're going through different aspects here of how we see. So for chromostereopasis, it is a limitation of our visual system. It's where we have two colors. If we place them next to each other, it actually is difficult for the eye to be able to focus on both colors and to be able to see them in good detail. So colors seem to sort of to float, to stand out, to other ones to have strong contrast. Quite often it's strongest with sort of reds and blues. Also can happen with other colors. You can see some of the combinations that we have on screen, for example, in terms of reds and greens. So takeaway from this here is it's quite simple. Don't put blue and red together or green and red together. Just avoid those color combinations because it will make it difficult for people to be able to read what is there effortlessly. Colorblindness is another aspect. So this actually affects more men than it does women. About 1 in 12 men, 1 in 200 women. They're colorblind. Now, what that means is that they can struggle to see, to perceive differences between certain pairs of colors. So most commonly it's between sort of reds, yellows, and greens. It is an important aspect given just the percentage of the population that will potentially experience some aspect of color blindness. Thankfully, there's lots of good, for example, websites and tools that are available that will apply different types of filter to simulate then the effect of color blindness. So you can, if you're not experiencing color blindness yourself, you can run and see how your web page or your application would look like subject to different types of blindness, and that will help you then identify where you may be using a color scheme that loses information for certain types of people. So takeaway in this here is be careful only using colors to imply meaning or to provide meaning to it, particularly for reds, greens, and blues. They're the colors then that we shouldn't use exclusively. And if you do want to do that there, make sure you have other types of ways of highlighting or differentiating between the items, between the data, other than simply using color on its own. Final slide here is that the meanings of color, they do vary by culture. And there's a nice link that you can see here. If you want to follow that will be quite good. It highlights across the different cultures across the world what are the colors that are associated with danger, with prosperity, with wealth, with all of those types of ones, with nature. And whilst there are some commonalities, there's also quite important differences as well. So important takeaway in this here is, depending upon the audience you're designing for and the types of things you want to convey, be careful using colors to convey certain types of positive emotion in terms of danger, or this is positive. Make sure you're picking and selecting colors then that you think will work or will be interpreted as you want them to be for the target population you're working with. So that's all we want to do in terms of covering this particular video. It's highlighted a few things then about our visual system and a few takeaways about what that means then when we're thinking about design. We're going to, in the next video, going to have a look at reading in terms of a more refined aspect that ties into our visual system.